to some questions about the Consumer Affairs Authority Act itself has some provisions.
Just going live.
Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the webinar on the implications of the emergency regulations that have been promulgated by His Excellency the President in relation to certain essential services. Welcome to this Meda Mawatha webinar. Today we have with us Honorable M.A. Sumantiran MP, President's Council. Then we have Dr. Harsha De Silva MP and Ms. Bhavani Fonseca, Attorney at Law, with us to have a discussion on the legal implications, the financial, the economic implications of the recently promulgated emergency regulations. I do not think that we need to spend any time introducing our speakers because all of them are very well known as eminent persons in their own fields. Therefore, I would first like to ask Mr. Sumantiran to make his opening remarks in relation to the constitutional framework and the legal framework in relation to emergency and its applicability. Mr. Sumantiran.
Thank you, Tisha. The legal framework for emergency rule in this country is found in Public Security Ordinance. It's an old law, pre-independence legislation, where if there is a threat to national security or public order, or if there is a problem in the supply of essential services, including food supplies, the President can, by promulgation, bring part 2 of that act or that ordinance into operation. Now, that's a technical way of actually declaring a state of emergency. Once a state of emergency is declared, it must be presented to Parliament as soon as possible, within 1 month definitely, and Parliament must approve it. Then every extension of that on a monthly basis must be approved by Parliament. When part 2 is brought into operation, section 5 of that act gives the President the power to make emergency regulations. Now that is done by the President all by himself, and that doesn't come for approval to Parliament. That is placed in Parliament for information. So it's a state of emergency, the declaration of state of emergency, that the Parliament must keep approving. President making regulations is not subject to parliamentary review, but if it is overbroad, if it is doesn't meet the objective, etc., for various reasons, that, or if it violates fundamental rights, it can be challenged in court. But in our constitution, Article 15(7) says emergency regulations are also law for the purpose of that particular article, which provides that by law you can restrict the operation and exercise of certain fundamental rights. And in Article 155 of our Constitution, the place of emergency regulations is very clearly spelled out. It says it will override all ordinary laws and is subject only to the Constitution. So you are then giving the President a carte blanche, as it were, President the power of legislation making, law-making power into his hands, where he can then start making law. So our country, of course, has had a long history of emergency rule. from 1971 onwards, we've had emergency rule with intermittently that being relaxed and so on. So we know how emergency regulations, offenses declared under that, how they have been utilized, how people have been kept incarcerated for long years without charge. All of that follows. But this time round, the way it was done itself is a bit curious, because the president did not announce to the country that he is bringing the country under emergency rule, as is normally done. Nor was a promulgation a pure and simple declaration of emergency. The Gazette notification is a convoluted one. It says under part 2, under section 5, I can exercise these powers, and there is a necessity to make regulations for the supply of food and other essential services. That's what it says. So first flush, it looked as though, something that people are experiencing, food shortage, particularly sugar, etc. And the government is doing something good, using emergency or rather using essential services and some kind of powers to regulate that. But in actual fact, the legal effect of what the president did was to declare a state of emergency. So the way they did it, the insidious way in which this was done, had its impact, because generally people didn't realize that we are under emergency rule. Even now, I don't think that implication has sunk in. Even for us politicians, it took a while before we realized, oh, emergency has been declared. And then we looked at the regulations. Perhaps later Bhavani will explain the regulations. But we looked at the other provisions of law, where there is provision under ordinary law to do all that you can do under emergency regulations, by way of emergency regulations, if it is to do with essential services and the supply of food. In fact, in the Public Security Ordinance, in section 17 itself, certain trade and other things can be declared as essential services without bringing part 2 into operation, without declaring a state of emergency. Much like section 12, which has been resorted to now for quite some time, where month after month, the president calls out the security forces to assist the police in maintaining law and order. That is without declaring a state of emergency. This is all in section 12 and etc. all in part 3. You have powers under part 3 under which you can act. Then we have this Consumer Affairs Authority Act, which was enacted in 2003. It consolidated many previous legislation, and it grants to the Consumer Affairs Authority wide powers with regard to regulating prices, with regard to acting in the case of traders not selling, refusing to sell products, acting in the case of hoarding. All of those powers they are in the Consumer Affairs Act. Then we have another legislation.
You have 1 minute more.
Then we have another ordinary legislation called the Essential Services Act. In fact, that also has been invoked. There is a regulation that has been made under the Essential Services Act, and that's being placed before Parliament on Tuesday. So, in my opinion, what the government is saying to the country as to what they want to use these powers for, all of those powers are there in various ordinary legislation that we have. You did not need to declare a state of emergency. In fact, the government was, I think, fighting shy of being known to have declared a state of emergency, and that is why they took this rather odd route of not actually openly promulgating a state of emergency, but hiding it and couching it in a different narrative, so that people don't become conscious that a state of emergency has been declared. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sumandiran, PC MP. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Harsha De Silva, MP, to discuss about the economic implications of the control of prices through emergency regulations. Dr. De Silva.
Thank you, Tisha. What Sumandiran just explained, I think is very clear that there was no necessity to impose a state of emergency to deal with food prices going up. The other day I was saying it's like bringing a jackhammer to do what can be done with a screwdriver. As he showed, this legislation can be used by the president to legislate by himself. It was now pointed out that even though Parliament must approve emergency on a monthly basis, that the regulations under emergency is only for purposes of information to Parliament, and Parliament has really no power to withhold any regulation that the President may deem necessary to be imposed at whatever time. Now, the question is, why are prices going up? Can the emergency regulation stop prices from going up? The prices are going up, particularly imported goods, because the rupee is crashing, because the dollar is going up in price. It's not only sugar that is hoarded, and I'll get to that in a minute, which is going up in price. LP gas went up in price. There was no hoarding of LP gas. Lentils went up in price. There was no hoarding of lentils. Canned fish went up in price. There is no hoarding of canned fish. Rice is going up in price. There is some sort of hoarding happening there. I'll come to that later also. So general price level is going up. Food is going up. Price of bread and, malupang has gone up. There is no hoarding there. There is no military man that is required to or can bring the prices down. So then why are prices going up? Fundamentally because there is indiscipline printing of money. When there is so much money in the system, there is a saying, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Too much money chasing too few goods. And every time you flush the system with money and there is no production increases to compensate for that increase of money, all what happens is prices begin to rise. A classic case here is, the dollar is like also, any commodity. The price that you pay for coconuts is denominated in rupees, 50 rupees, 60 rupees, 70 rupees, and so on. Likewise, the dollar. Who is hoarding the dollar? Right? Now they are saying, look, exporters are hoarding dollars. So exporters need to, convert a certain amount of dollars, and part of that needs to go into the central bank. Just today, the government has said, look, exporters are not doing that. So can the emergency rule be applied to pry open the deposits of the exporters or their accounts and get them to bring the money into the local banks here? I mean, that's also hoarding, if you really look at it that way, right? So can the emergency rules be applied by the central bank, for instance, to break the quote-unquote hoarding of of dollars. So it's not possible. I don't think so, right? So therefore, as long as the central bank and the government thinks that it can control interest rates at unrealistic levels, and in order to do that, continue to print money. I mean, as you know, this is unprecedented. Over 1.25 trillion rupees has been, printed in the last 20 months. So that is the primary reason. But beyond that, of course, there is some hoarding that is happening. Both Mr. Sumanthiran and I are in the Public Finance Committee, and we found early on this year that once the tax on sugar was reduced from 50 rupees to 25 cents, certain people brought large amounts of sugar, stored it, and sold it at a price higher than what was gazetted, which was 85 rupees. Now, we sought a forensic audit. I said, we need to find out who these hoarders were, what actually they did, who did they sell to, was it legit or not? Because Satosa bought sugar at higher prices and then sold some amount at the gazetted price of 85 rupees, making a loss there as well. But the government didn't act on it. There was no, investigation. Everybody talks about it. Was there an investigation? Did they look into what happened? No. I personally know, Suma also knows, multiple times we have requested that this audit be conducted. Now I understand the Auditor General is doing the audit. If the audit was done, then they would have found out who was behind it, and this would not have gone to this extent, the hoarding and the the resulting situation here. Because even now, right, sugar goes at about 465, I think, dollars per metric ton. But anywhere between $4 to $450 it was trading at in the last several months. And even if you paid in the black market for 225 rupees to the dollar and brought the sugar here and paid all the taxes and loading charges and everything, it still would have been about 105, 106 rupees. So they could have sold at 130 or 40. They did not have to increase it to 220 and so on. So there is a component of hoarding. But as Sumanthiran pointed out earlier, we didn't have to bring in emergency regulations to deal with it. And also, when you say hoarding, I was reading in the papers today that it was embarrassing to the government to find out subsequently that some of this that was in the warehouses were actually sold to sort of confectionaries and soft drink makers and so on. And they were not hoarding them. It was being stocked by industrial users.
I'm sorry, but your time is running out. So you can finish in another minute.
Right. So they were actually stocks for production, intermediate inputs. So can the government come and take the sugar that is intended to be used in biscuit making, for example, right? So that's another issue. And also there is a sort of oligopoly created by a licensing regime that has been created. And that gives only certain people the opportunity to bring in, and that creates a cartel that has no competition. Therefore, prices can be maintained at a higher level. And I'll just finish in the next 30 seconds. And sort of expectation of what the currency is going to be, because importers cannot now, they don't have, they cannot cover their forex risk with forward purchases. Forward purchases have been banned by the central bank. So they are at the mercy of the government in terms of what the dollar is going to be in the future. So these guys are bringing 6 months on a 6 months credit, and they don't know what the prices are going to be. So they, on the other hand, are trying to, manage their own businesses. So there are ways in which this can be sorted out, but certainly prices, once this hoarded stuff is taken out and sold, it will be gone, right? So there is no more warehouses to be broken open and released to the market. Then what happens? Then what happens, right? If this continues, the money printing continues, then what happens? Inflation continues to go up. Then can the army go and control the price at the supermarket? I don't think so. So this is just a short-term, yet unnecessary step, which has brought in a lot of international repercussions also, because people are looking at this country as in a real basket case now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. De Silva. I would like to now ask Ms. Bhavani Fonseca, attorney at law, to give her opinion on the emergency regulations that have been promulgated for the regulation of essential services. Bhavani.
Thank you, Tisha, and thank you to the organizers, because I think this is a very timely discussion in terms of when the Parliament debate is happening tomorrow on emergency regulations or the state of emergency. Both speakers have spoken in terms of the legality, the constitutionality, and the economic dimensions. So I won't go into a lot of detail into that, but I think there needs to be a very important point that needs to be made, is that did we actually need this emergency? And I think Mr. Sumandiran has raised some of the laws that are also in existence in terms of the Consumer Affairs Authority, the Public Services Ordinance, Public Security Ordinance that also provides for these powers. So we were all very surprised when the news broke on Monday evening that the president had declared a state of emergency. And on Tuesday, we saw the regulations in Sinhala. So I think there's also a point to be made that information was very slow in coming and being publicly available. Now, couple of things we need to be mindful of. So there were 3 gazettes issued. One was declaring a state of emergency. The other 2 connected to this is one appointing a Commissioner General for Essential Services, and the other on the emergency regulations per se. And I'll speak to both of them. But there's another one, a gazette issued under the Essential Public Services Act, also setting out essential services. So I think one needs to really question, in terms of the legal scheme we already have, the Consumer Affairs Authority and the various other bodies, we can go into detail on some of these. Do we need a separate gazette setting out the essential services? Then we have, under these emergency regulations, essential services, and in terms of actors, the Commissioner General of Essential Services and competent authority. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details. If there are questions, we can talk about these, but one particular aspect we need to realize is that the decision-making now in terms of how the regulations are going to be operationalized, implemented, remains with the Commissioner General of Essential Services. Now, in that, the individual is also very important. It's a major general, retired major general, a military official that has been appointed to this position. In the past, Sri Lanka has had emergency regulations. We've also had Commissioner General for Essential Services appointed. In the past, those positions in times of the war, as well as post-tsunami, were civil administrators. Those who had positions in the civil administration, experienced individuals in terms of a state of emergency, an exceptional situation where you need this position created to oversee, coordinate these entities. But for the first time, we have a military official holding this position. Now, this has huge implications in terms of the militarization. The other dimension is there are different actors who can be appointed as competent authorities. The IGP, the Consumer Affairs Authority, are named in these regulations, who also have a task in terms of ensuring or going in to check, ensuring services are delivered. So there is a broad scheme that's provided. Now, in that also, one of the entities, the Consumer Affairs Authority, the chairman is also a former military official. So we're going to have two former military officials playing a key role in the provision of services, essential services and supply under the scheme of emergency. So this basically consolidates but entrenches militarization in the guise of this economic crisis, economic emergency, whatever it's called. Now, also remember the government has publicly come out and said there's no shortage. It's a supply issue. Anyone who, I think an international channel highlighted, there were queues of people standing, and the official response by the government is that's not queues, that's social distancing. That this is actually a way of being mischievous. So that also has a relevance in terms of the emergency regulations, because within the supply and the services where they list it out, anyone who's trying to interrupt or disrupt or create problems, and that's termed very broadly as encourages or persuading someone to not do their duty, can also be held as undermining, as an offense under these emergency regulations. So this is also very, very worrying, that it's not just the arbitrariness, the militarization, the normalizing of an exceptional situation. It also could be used to target those who are even questioning the implementation of these regulations. Someone who critiques the Consumer Affairs Authority going in to check could be seen as someone who's trying to undermine or persuading someone from doing their duty under the emergency regulation. So it can really have a chilling effect. The other point I want to raise, and I know it's we have to keep it short, the opening remarks, is just the normalization, the arbitrariness, the militarization. But the question is there a need at this moment? And I think Harsha raised these points. Now, we have the Consumer Affairs Authority coming in June with gazettes saying, for those who are operational in rice, in sugar, there are 3 gazettes that I came across, there could be more, to report to the Consumer Affairs Authority in terms of storage. So there is now a mechanism, the Consumer Affairs Authority set in place, where they have that information. Now, what seems to have happened is, regardless of, and maybe some didn't report, that's a question to ask, but those who even reported and went through that scheme seems to be now targeted. So does the emergency now create this complete arbitrariness, where those who actually engaged with the authority that was in place, that is in place, is now being targeted? And overnight, this seems to have happened. So does that create, and I'll end this year, does this create also questions of instability, uncertainty? Those who want to also actually, in terms of providing services, providing supplies, that also raise questions, is this worth engaging? Because this seems extremely ad hoc and extremely arbitrary. So I'll end here. I think we can go into questions in terms of some of the details later.
Thank you, Bhavani. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can post your questions on the live stream, and I can forward them to the panelists as you whatever the questions, if they're directed, or I can just generally post it to the panelists. And while the questions keep coming, I would like to start off with Mrs. Sumanthiran. Mrs. Sumanthiran, now you spoke about several laws that have the similar sort of powers in terms of what the emergency regulation seems to be doing. So in that sense, we have seen now in the UK, as far back as March 2020, their parliament passed a corona-related law that made provisions for various things, including food services, health services, additional doctors, nurses, support staff being registered, so on and so forth. But in our country, we haven't seen anything corona-related except for the recently passed legislation and this particular emergency regulations. Do you think that in our society that the government thinks that they can go ahead and do anything in a vacuum or in an extra constitutional setting?
Thank you, Tisha, for bringing this up. In March last year itself, we constantly told the government that we need proper legislation to deal with this issue. UK Parliament immediately passed special legislation. India passed a special legislation. Singapore amended their Infectious Diseases Act. Greece passed a legislation. There are so many countries, some parliaments that were in recess, met in emergency sessions and passed laws. Our laws, these quarantine laws that are supposedly being used, is over 100 years old, 120 years old or something. The other one, the Contagious Diseases Ordinance, is over 150 years old. And those were brought in for specific issues. One was for cholera. Now, that doesn't really meet with this new phenomenon. And you had to make legislation. But of course, on the 2nd of March, Parliament had been dissolved. But in the Constitution, there is a provision that in an emergency, the dissolved Parliament can be resummoned. And so all the parties in opposition parties, signed and asked the government to resummon Parliament. And one of the reasons we mentioned in that was that we needed to enact new legislation. The second most important thing, or you can say it the other way, the other important thing was that public finance was in the hands of Parliament, and we had to pass for spending for this unforeseen thing that had arisen. Government refused. So we went to court. 10 days of argument, court refused leave to proceed without assigning reasons. During that time, I took the initiative when we drafted. I must acknowledge the function of Dr. Gihan Gunatilaka, who was at Oxford at that time, who did most of the work and made the first draft. So we actually said there was a draft. If you want to use it, here it is. And we looked at we drafted that having looked at the entire, legislation around the world, but framed it in a way that is familiar to us. So we framed it just like the Disaster Management Act, a council, and that council, on the recommendation of the Director General of Health Services and the Minister of Health, declares a public health emergency. So then it's a different kind of emergency, not an emergency brought in because there is threat to national security. It's not a security related issue. It's a disease, a contagious disease related emergency. And then various provisions under that could have been used. For some reason, the government obstinately refused to take a look at that. Then when the new parliament was convened in August last year, again, I said, now one of the first things that must be done is this. They did not take it. So in October last year, I actually sent it to Parliament. But although it is not there in the standing orders, they sent it to the Attorney General, who sat on it for 6 months. 6 long months, and then sent it back saying it is all right. He didn't find anything wrong with it, but made spelling mistakes in the document that he sent back. And then the first reading is over on the 23rd of April. I presented it to Parliament. First reading is over. No one has challenged it within 1 week. That bill is there to be passed. Now, under the standing orders, what is there is that you must send it to the relevant ministry. They have sent it to the Ministry of Health. But if you ask the Minister of Health, the previous one, the current one, they don't know anything about it. So that is how they have dealt with this issue. I have repeatedly said at the party leaders meeting that this is the primary function of Parliament in this pandemic. I mean, we are legislation making body. You can do other things, but you must make legislation, and you are not doing that. I'm not saying that what we drafted and gave must be passed, but government must take, if you want, take that, have a look at it, do something and pass it. Now, most recently, of course, at a party leaders meeting, they all praised this draft. Minister of Justice, Professor Pires, everybody said, okay, that's a good thing. We will talk to you and we will do something. They were to meet me at a meeting. The Minister of Health, Minister of Justice, both spoke to me and said, we'll set a meeting and invite you also. But that did not happen. That was to happen in the last week of August. That did not happen. And then on the 30th of August, we have this emergency regulation. So they decided not to take that route, but to bring in emergency rule. So that is the situation with regard to legislation. And I still say we need that regulation. We need that legislation. That is important. Parliament hasn't acted properly in this pandemic for over a year. When its primary function is legislation making, even a private member's bill that has been presented, they are refusing to take note of and make legislation. In that, all of these issues are dealt with. You can make regulations. So it's not a security related thing at all. Now the worry about the emergency, declaration of emergency, is that will be used to repress, to oppress, oppress dissent. We have seen various protests, legitimate protests by various persons, and the government is interested in putting that down. To the extent that there was questions in Parliament raised about the function of the Judicial Service Commission as well in this context, whether they actually advise the magistrates to make orders under public nuisance provisions. Apparently, the Judicial Service Commission reply has come, and the Minister of Justice will read it out in Parliament on Tuesday. That will be very interesting to listen to. But in this context, if there is some democratic protest or dissent, tomorrow you will have emergency regulations being made suppressing that. Even freedom of speech can be suppressed. Bringing out, telling the country the truth with regard to these matters can be suppressed by emergency regulation. We'll have to then go to court, challenge those regulations. That will take a month of Sundays. We don't know what will happen. So the government has decided, I think, this is my position, that due to their sagging popularity, because of this huge unpopularity that they are facing, they have taken this, as Harsha said, a jackhammer, they've taken this multi-barrel rocket launcher, as it were, in their hand. They have now cocked it and they are ready to fire. All that the president has to do is frame a regulation overnight, and the next day that is law, and people can be arrested and remanded for speaking the truth, telling the country what is actually going on, and for various other legitimate democratic acts.
Thank you, Mr. Sumandiran. I have a few questions coming from our audience. It's directed towards the members of parliament, so I will direct it to Dr. Harsha De Silva. If Consumer Affairs Authority is unable to perform the given tasks of monitoring and enforcing the law, what would you do differently if you were part of the government? And there was another question. I will link that also. Criticism is valid. However, it has to be constructive criticism. What would be the answer to the current economic crisis? other than taking loans. So Dr. De Silva, if you could answer both these questions together. One is that the Consumer Affairs Authority, if they're not doing their job, what do you do? Especially given that on the 2nd of September, the chairman of the Consumer Affairs Authority had issued 2 new gazettes controlling price in terms of Section 20, subsection 5. So if they are doing all of that, then, and they're still unable to control the price escalation, what would you do differently if you were in the government?
Okay, valid question. So what they were saying is, look, it doesn't have teeth, or rather, you could just fine them 5,000 rupees or something like that, and they can just pay the 5,000 rupees and forget about it. So there is nothing they could really do to, break the locks and take the hoarded goods out. Now, what the government said in the last month or so was that they were going to increase this fine from 5,000 to 100,000. And they came on national television and said, look, we are going to fine these people 100,000 rupees or whatever, 200,000 rupees. They were going to increase the fine so that the incentive to hoard was going to be taken away. I mean, that's how markets work, with incentives and disincentives, not with multi-barrel rockets and jackhammers. That is not a market mechanism. So that never took place. That never took place. So if the Consumer Authorities Legislation Act was to be strengthened, they could have done that. They could have given the powers, additional powers necessary to break the doors of these silos or whatever go downs if they needed to do that. But Suma just earlier pointed out that even in the public security ordinance, that there are clauses that can be used in order to do what is now being done without promulgating what they did and announce a state of emergency. So if we were in office, what we would have done is to use the legislation that is available and tweak it where necessary, and utilize market-friendly legislation to deal with what is here called a market failure. If the market was functioning perfectly, then the government or the regulator does not have to intervene. But as you all know, markets are not perfect. And because of existing licensing regime, a cartel has been formed, an oligopoly is there. There's one big trader, 3-4 others, and they control the market, and therefore the regulator has to intervene. So that could have been done in that way, and if we were in office, that is what we would have done. And the second point is what Mrs. Sumanthiran earlier referred to, is legislation that is specifically designed or developed to deal with this pandemic, which should have been, adopted before, taking this last step type of thing, what do you call imposing emergency. Now, the second question is about constructive criticism and what can we do without taking loans. That's a long discussion, and I don't want to get into that at this point in time. But one must understand here that if you look at, for instance, the paddy issue, the rice issue, you see, if you are paying the farmer 55 to 60 rupees a kilo, which is what they are getting because certainly because of inflation that I said earlier. How can that paddy be converted to rice and milled and polished and transported and wholesaled and retailed to the consumer at 98 rupees. It's not possible. You see, there's always some sort of formula. You know, it takes 1.6 kilos of paddy to make 1 kilo of rice. And there are other additional costs that are incurred in that process, and transportation, logistics, all of that. So you have to be realistic. So you can't say, I'm going to increase the price of paddy, but I'm going to decrease the price of rice. It can't happen, right? Now, by saying, look, we are not going to let who are called third parties, right? People who are not producers and people are not millers, holding a certain amount of paddy in their stock. The army is now going in, prying open those doors, taking the paddy out and taking it elsewhere. What is therefore happening is the small and medium scale millers have no paddy to mill. There's no paddy to mill, right? So what is happening is, in this whole exercise of bringing in the military, they are, whether it is done with the intention of killing the small and medium enterprise or it is inadvertent, I don't know. But what is happening is a small and medium guy is getting dislocated, dislodged. He's going out of business. And in another 6 months, what you will have when the next harvest comes along in about another 4.5 months, 5 months time, is that you will have a strong oligopoly, right? And the control of pricing will not be possible using even emergency law. So that's how I see what's going on now. And just to finish this, during our time, what we did, particularly in the rice market, rice milling market, was we created competition. That is the only way to do it in a sustainable manner. We created competition by creating what was called a Shakti Rice program, where we brought in small and medium millers from 8 districts, created a cooperative, and through the cooperative, we started competing with the big millers, the Dudleys and the New Ratnas of this world. So you have to use tools, market-friendly tools, to have a sustainable solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harsha. Bhavani, I have a question for you. That is, now in terms of the emergency, upon the declaration of emergency, the president can not only regulate this particular incident, but he can regulate other aspects also. So that is one of the biggest criticisms of a declaration of emergency in a situation like this. In the past, we've seen the governments trying to justify this sort of situation, saying peaceful use of emergency laws. Does that bode well overall in a democracy? How does that affect our international relations and standing? Does that have a negative impact of, in the sense that the government is trying to achieve through the back door what they can't achieve through the front door? Could you give a bit of an explanation on that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Tisha, I mean, the point has been made. We've had emergency over the decades, and the PSO was brought in 1948, and it has been used ever since by all governments. So successive governments have brought in emergency. During the war, it was there for decades. Even in the last government, we had emergency brought in twice, in 2018 and 2019, one around the Kandy violence and one post Easter Sunday attacks. Now, many of us who've been monitoring this, challenging it, critiquing it, always question why there has to be emergency. And emergency, I think it's a larger question, is brought when it's an exceptional situation, and really sometimes you really wonder, what do people understand as exceptional? Because I feel now what is being brought in and done in a very secretive manner is normalizing these behaviors. And that's what we saw during the war and post-tsunami and more recently. Now, emergency can be brought in for a very short time period. That's possible. We saw that in 2018, we saw that in 2019, where, the government said we are bringing it for a particular purpose. Now, in 2019, we actually challenged it, saying even for that particular purpose, it was overbroad, vague, and there were various concerns. So, even though the government of the day might justify certain practices, I think it's very important for us as citizens to keep an eye, monitor, and really study this, what's happening. And that's why it's very important these discussions happen, because the main point that all of us are raising here is when you have existing laws, when you have structures in place, strengthen those, then bring in these new things that can be abused. Now, emergency, the point that the question is, can the president bring regulations on any subject? Yes, that's a simple answer. Tomorrow, we may wake up to the fact that there's a new regulation, possibly even banning a discussion like this. That's how broad the powers are. So I think we all need to recognize, while being constructive, but while giving the government some benefit of the doubt, emergency regulations in the hands of very powerful executive with very limited checks is extremely dangerous. That said, now tomorrow's debate in Parliament, where hopefully the two MPs will raise these issues, are very important too. I mean, this is a fora that these issues can be raised. But let's be also very realistic. That's once a month, and that doesn't impact the regulations. The president can issue the regulations tomorrow night after the debate. So that's the amount of power one individual has. And I said this before, this is also in a context where the military role is alarming. The present, the serving military and the former officials are alarming, not just in terms of security. They are very much involved in the pandemic response, from vaccines to quarantine to surveillance. Now they're involved in consumer issues, on economic issues. So how far is this going to go? Is emergency not just normalizing a state of affairs? Is it now going to normalize militarization as well? So these are, I think, very, very worrying times. And one individual can bring in so many more things. And that's something we all have to be very, very mindful of.
Thank you, Bhavani.
Tisha, can I just ask, is it possible to ask a question from Bhavani? Yeah, you said something that
let's try to answer it subsequently though. I have a couple of other questions also. Right. You can ask the question. We will just keep it in the back burner.
No. Because she said that, a discussion like this could be, banned. I mean, under emergency regulations. I mean, can you sort of explain what you really meant by that? Not now, but maybe subsequently.
So Harsha, what I say is the president can issue new regulations anytime. Tonight, tomorrow night, after your debate in Parliament, he can issue regulations which put certain restrictions. Now, we will have to study these regulations to see what form it is. But the existing regulations in itself, as I mentioned before, if you're perceived as trying to disrupt even the services in terms of trying to convince someone of not addressing a particular service, that can be held as an offense, as it is in the present regulations. So that's very specific to the essential services and supply. But tonight, tomorrow night, next week, the week after, any regulation can be brought. And this has happened before. This has happened before. This is not that we're talking about a hypothetical situation. Sri Lanka has had such draconian regulations, which has impacted freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, due process safeguards. And I think we can even have a separate discussion on our past legacy of abuses. That I think we all need to be very much thinking about this when we talk about the present one, which is introduced as an economic measure. And that's for me even more scary. It's couched in economic terms, it's couched as consumer protection. And what is it going to lead to is my worry.
Thank you, Bhavani. We have another question. It is actually connected to what you just explained, but I would like both lawyers in this forum to address it a little bit more because it has serious repercussions on the rights of the people. මේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් කවුරු හරි කතා කිරීමෙන් හෝ ප්‍රශ්න කිරීමෙන් අත්අඩංගුවට ගතහොත් පුරවැසියෙකු හැටියට අපිට තිබෙන රැකවරණය කුමක්ද? Mr. Sumantiran and Bhavani, if both of you could address this question. So the question is, if කවුරු හරි අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්තොත් මේක ගැන කතා කරලා මොකද්ද පුරවැසියෙක් හැටියට ඔවුන්ට තියෙන රැකවරණය? Mr. Sumantiran?
ඒ රෙගුලාසි ගැන අපි කලින් බලන්න ඕනේ. රෙගුලාසියෙන් තහනම් කරන්නේ මොනවද කියලා අපි ඉස්සෙල්ලාම බලන්න ඕනේ. නිකන් කතා කරන්න බෑ කියලා රෙගුලාසියක් ගේන්නේ නැහැ කවදාවත්. Spreading of rumors ඒ වගේ මොනවාරි ගේන්න පුළුවන්. අතරඟුට ගත්තොත් ඒ රෙගුලාසිය තමයි තියෙයි කොච්චර කල් ඒ පුද්ගලයාව අතරඟුවෙන් තියන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේ ඩීටේල්ස් ඒ රෙගුලාසියෙන් තමයි අපි බලන්න ඕනේ. තාම ඒ වගේ රෙගුලාසියක් හදලා නැහැ. Bhavani, want to elaborate more clearly on what I said?
No, I think you said
Before-
it. I think,
Before
yeah,
you
sorry. There are other questions. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, there's one more. හදිසි නීතිය තුලින් ඉදිරියේ පැන නැගීමට නියමිත උද්ඝෝෂණ හා ජනතා නැගිටීම වැළැක්වීමට අනියමින් යොදාගතහොත් මීට ගත යුතු ක්‍රියාමාර්ග කවරේද? සාමාන්‍ය ජනතාවට හදිසි නීතිය බිල්ලෙක් ලෙස පෙන්වීමක්ද මේ සංවාදය තුලින් වෙන්නේ? Bhavani, would you like to answer that? Whether you are
Yeah,
trying
no.
to... There's a saying in Sinhala,
Yes. Yeah.
is this
Yeah,
one of those, or is there actually a reason for us to be very concerned?
මං හිතන්නේ අපේ ඇත්තටම ඉතිහාසය ගැන බැලුවම emergency regulations ඒ පාවිච්චි කරපු හැටි ඒක ගැන බලනකොට ඇත්තටම අපි මේක පොඩ්ඩක් තව දුර දිගට හිතන්න ඕනේ. ඒක ගැන සාකච්ඡාවක් තියෙන්න ඕනේ. මොකද දැන් අපි තොරතුරු ගැන දන්නේ නැතුව හිටියොත් ඇත්තටම අපි දන්න හෙට වෙනකොට මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ කියලා. ඒකයි මේ වගේ සංවාදයක් අවශ්‍ය. සංවාදයක් අවශ්‍යයි. ඒ දැන් රෙගුලාසියක් අලුතෙන් ගෙනාවොත් ඒකත් බලන්න ඕන. නිකන් අපිට කියන්න බෑ මේක වැරදි කියලා. ඒකයි මං කිව්වේ මොකක් හරි දැන් ගිය සුමානේ ගෙනාපු එක ඇත්තටම අපි අංගහරවාද බදාද බැලුවම තමයි තීරුනේ මේකයි දැන් ගෙනත් තියෙන්නේ කියලා. ඒක දැන් තොරතුරු නැහැ. ඒකයි මම ඉස්සෙල්ලාම කිව්වේ. අපි පළවෙනියටම දැක්කේ සිංහල ගැසට් එක. දෙමළෙන් ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් පස්සේ ආවේ. ඒතකොට ඒ තොරතුරු මාර්ගෙන් උත් ඇත්තටම ප්‍රශ්නයක් තිබ්බා. හුඟක් කට්ටියට ඒ තොරතුරු දැන් ඒක මේ සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් විතරයි හම්බුනේ. දැන් ඉස්සරහට රෙගුලාසියක් ගෙනාවොත් ඒකත් අපි ඇත්තටම බලන්න ඕන මොකද්ද ඒ භාෂා තුනෙන්ම තියනවාද මොකද්ද ඒ රෙගුලාසිය තියෙන්නේ ඒකේ සංවාදයක් තියෙන්න ඕන. නීතිය පැත්තෙන් ඇත්තටම මොකක් හරි චැලෙන්ජ් කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඒක චැලෙන්ජ් කරන්න පුළුවන්. එක දෙයක් මතක් තියාගන්න ඕන උසාවියට යන එක අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන්. උසාවියට ගිහිල්ලා තියෙනවා. ඒත් උසාවියට ගියා කියලා එකපාරටම අපිට මේකෙන් දිනන්න වෙන්නෙත් නැහැ. මොකද සමහර වෙලාව උසාවි හුඟක් කල් යන්න පුළුවන් නඩුවක් අහන්න. දැන් මේ දවස්වල හුඟක් වෙලාවට උසාවි අර urgent matter එකක් විතරයි ගේන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒකයි දැන් මේක challenge කරන එක විතරක් නෙමෙයි. ඇත්තටම අපි බලන්න ඕන පාර්ලිමේන්තු මන්ත්‍රීලා මාර්ගයෙන් ප්‍රශ්න අහන්න පුළුවන් මාධ්‍ය මාර්ගයෙන් ප්‍රශ්න අහන්න ඒ සංවාදය තමයි වැඩියෙන්ම මම කියන්නේ දැනට අවශ්‍ය.
ස්තුති භවානි මම හිතන්නේ අපේ අදට නියමිත කාලයක් මේ වෙනකොට අවසానයි. මේ සාකච්ඡාව තුළින් අපිට ගොඩක් දේවල් ඉගෙන ගන්න හැකියාව ලැබුණා. අපේ විද්වත් මණ්ඩලය ඉතාමත්ම පැහැදිලිව අපිට පැහැදිලි කරලා දුන්නා නීතිය අනුව මොකද්ද මේ සිදුවෙන්නේ, ඒකේ තියෙන භයානකකම, ඒකේ තියෙන වාණිජමය සහ ආර්ථිකමය ගැටලුව මොකද්ද යන සියලු කරුණු ගැන මේ සාකච්ඡාවක් සිදු වුණා. ඉතින් මම හිතන්නේ මේ විදිහට සාකච්ඡා කිරීම ඉදිරියට යෑම තමයි ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත්. ඒක තුලින් තමයි මේ තොරතුරු අපිට දැනගන්න පුළුවන්. තොරතුරු දැන ගැනීම තුලින් තමයි අපිට නිවැරදි මතයකට එන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් ඒ ක්‍රියාදාමයට සම්බන්ධ වීම සම්බන්ධයෙන් විශේෂයෙන්ම පාර්ලිමේන්තු මන්ත්‍රීවරුන් දෙදෙනාටත් භවානි ෆොන්සේකා මහත්මියටත් විකල්ප ප්‍රතිපත්ති කේන්ද්‍රයේ මම ඉතාමත්ම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා. අද මේ සවස් කාලයේදී පැය කාලයක් මිඩංගු කරලා අපි ඔය ගැන දැනුවත් කිරීමට කටයුතු කිරීම ගැන. අපි මේ වගේම තවත් සංවාදයකදී ඉදිරියේදී ඔබ සමග එක්තහු වීමට බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන අද දිනට මෙම සංවාදය අවසන් කරනවා. ස්තුතියි, සුබ රාත්‍රිය. Thank you everyone. Good night.